Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar today. I'm John Bartz with Network Consulting Services. Today's topic is why IT asset management matters. And with me is our ITAM expert, Todd Hogan. Good morning, Todd.
Good morning, John.
Todd has over 20 years of asset management experience consulting with CIOs and CFOs on best practices. And today we're taking a different approach, more of a product-agnostic, strategic view from the treetops, so to speak. In this first in a series of ITAM webinars with Todd. So no product demos today, no speeds and feeds. We're examining the what and the why today. Okay, Todd, let's dive right in and discuss why IT asset management matters.
Well, welcome, everyone. Thanks for spending a little bit of time with us today. John and I are excited to share with you some ITAM best practice concepts and why businesses really care about asset management. We're going to cover some basics about what are ITAM best practices? What are some of the things that you should look for as you're thinking about either evolving your existing program or beginning a new program? And then we're going to talk about why businesses really care. Why do executives care? And I think that's an important discussion because many times, whether those of you who are in the room or are on the call today are in leadership positions or you're a stakeholder, you're an administrator, it's really important to understand why the business cares about asset management because that helps us make better decisions about how to roll the program out so that we can get the value that we need and get ongoing support. That's really the focus of this discussion, is to understand how we can present something back to the business that has meaningful value so that we can solve some of the problems we're having. And then at the very end, we'll talk about our next series. So let's get started. ITAM basics. I'm sure there's a lot of experience here on the call. Many of you have probably been doing it like myself for many years, and maybe some of you are just getting started. But there are really two focus areas by which people, or customers I should say, come into the asset market. Sometimes it's both, but we'll talk about them. The first is an operational focus. What you're really after is making sure you can get the right asset to the right customer, the right end user at the right time. And we see a lot of this in fast-growing companies that are really, have tremendous growth, maybe even a lot of new hires. And so they want to make sure they get the asset there. You hear complaints like it's taking too long to onboard, it's taking too long to get the right asset or the right software to the right people. So it's an operational focus, all about making sure we can get that asset through the procurement process, through the setup phases, and onto that desktop of that user as quickly as possible. The other phase that people come through is more of a fiscal, regulatory, security kind of perspective. They're very concerned about the cost of the asset, managing those costs, optimizing those costs, and in addition to that, regulatory and security concerns. So things like software compliance. Very concerned about making sure we're in compliance with our software agreements, or regulatory. Maybe we've got some personal identifiable information, or we've got HIPAA or SOX or GDPR data out in our environment. And believe it or not, asset management has a great deal to do with maintaining and protecting ourselves as a company from regulatory concerns. And certainly what seems to be growing rapidly is the need for security, and security demanding more and more and better asset information. What assets do I have? What software do I have? It's critical. So these are the two focus areas which typically customers come into approaching one or the other, and sometimes you need both. But the important part here is to remember that asset management is a big discipline, and there are a lot of things that it can do. And as you're getting ready to start your program or grow your program, it's important to know where the business focus is so that you don't get distracted with things that really aren't on the top of the plate, if you will. And the reason for that is a good asset program might take you up to 3 years to go from nothing to becoming very mature in that environment. So knowing where you're coming from, what your roots are, what the business issues are really important. And so looking for a solution that can provide a comprehensive solution is really important. Oftentimes we just have one particular need in our business, but if we haven't put ourselves on a platform or with a provider that can take us down a long journey of full asset maturity, then we kind of do ourselves a disservice because we get halfway down the road and we have to change to a different model or a different tool. Let's take a look at the assets from kind of a repository standpoint. Asset management begins, we all have a need at some point in our business to get an asset of some type into the business to be able to perform the functions of the business. So it starts with that asset request. And this is very much a part of asset management. It's part of being integrated with your service management or your request processes. Once we receive that request, we need to check, manage that request, check in inventory. Do we have it available? If not, we need to get it through purchasing and get a purchase order for that device or asset and get that brought into our environment. You'll notice here that I've circled purchasing with a big red box. And as we talk today, I hope you'll understand that from an ITAM best practice perspective, knowing what you own is absolutely critical. It's really something, oftentimes we'll go out and we'll meet with customers around the globe and they'll say, hey, I've got 50,000 devices, I'm managing them through SCCM or BigFix or Avanti EPM, and I know what I've got. And so in those environments, I'll say, well, that's great that you know that you've got 50,000 devices on your network, but what happened if your company bought 60,000 devices? So if we don't know what we own, it's really hard to protect ourselves against things that are being lost or stolen or misused, or maybe we're even having a problem with people bringing their own devices, and so now you have unsanctioned, unauthorized devices on your network. So knowing what you purchase is really, really important to asset management. Once we get that asset through the purchasing process, we're going to receive it, and then we're going to give it an asset tag so that we know based on our identifier that that's an asset in our environment. And from there, the asset can begin what we call its life cycle management process. It can be assigned to an individual, to a location. We can move it in and out of inventory. We can repair it. We can refresh it as it gets older. And eventually, we're going to dispose of it. So this is the kind of that operational focus. And this is really important. If we don't get these steps down in the beginning of our asset management program with quality data and quality information about those assets, where they came from, it's really hard to be successful going forward. So now we've got this information in our repository. And by the way, most of this information or all of this information came from a good procurement source. Maybe I'm buying directly from HP or Dell or Lenovo or CDW or Insight or wherever, and I can pull that purchasing data in and gather all this information about my asset. I can then make the assignments to where I want it to be allocated, to the user, location, things of that nature. But then the next step is something we call discovery. So in our industry, we have a variety of different tools. You might be using, popular ones are Avanti Endpoint Manager or SCCM. You might be using those tools today to discover on the wire what assets are out there. But according to ITAM best practice, again, remember that red box up above is really the center of the universe. That tells us exactly what we have. We use discovery tools in a best practice model to validate that those assets that we know about through our procurement activities, that they're still there, that they're functioning the way we want them to. We can even pull out information about who's using them. If we're using some IP subnet to location mapping technology, we can even tell what location they're in. So we really use discovery tools, or a physical inventory, if you will, as a way of validating our assumptions about where those assets are, who's using them, are they functioning as they should, are they ready to be refreshed, and what state are they in the disposal or in the life cycle process, all the way until we dispose of them. So when you combine good information about the request, the purchasing information, and who we've assigned it to as an asset management team, we compare that against the discovery tools that are reporting daily or weekly. Now we can begin to manage these assets. Without discovery tools, it's kind of like herding cats, and it's really impossible. So discovery tools are an excellent way that we can keep track of these assets and know where they're at. With this combination, and once we have this foundation set, and it's so important that you don't run faster than you can walk and build a strong foundation of quality data. Once you get this point, then the other pieces of asset management can come into play. Things like procurement and vendor management, that contract compliance we talked about. Oftentimes people will say, Todd, I'm really worried about software compliance. I want to do software compliance. And I'll say, well, do you know what hardware you have? And they'll say, no, I just care about software. Well, you can't get to a software compliance position if you don't know what hardware you have. So again, those foundational pieces that are kind of in the green and green tones, those are the things we have to have before we can move forward. Another one, the third box down in that column, called fiscal management. This is something that your CIOs and CFOs will really love when you can provide it for them. And that's the ability to say, here's how much spend we have for all the assets that are in sales or marketing or engineering. That's really critical in being able to help get accountability of those assets to say, this is where they're allocated, here's who's using them, and this is how the company's consuming them. Security and risk compliance, a big thing. Security, there's just no way anyone, your CISO, your compliance officers in the company, they cannot do their job unless you can help them understand what hardware and what software is in the environment. It's the only way they can provide security. So if you're having a challenge getting funding or support for your program, your best friend, I promise you, your best friend is the security officers. They truly need this information about accurate hardware and accurate software information, who's using those assets, where are they located. So if you're ever struggling to get support with your upline executive staff, get your security person and have them help you sell the proposition of why a good asset management program is so important. So there's lots of other things we can now talk about: forecasting and planning. We can talk about project management. All of the full disciplines of asset management are there, but there's another dimension to asset management that Gartner talks about, and it's called process. Gartner says that process is really 80% and the tool is 20%. So what that means is no matter how good of a tool you choose, that tool is only limited by how good your processes and policies are about how you manage those assets. But what's important as you look for a good tool and a good provider is that they have things in the tool that can help you enforce those policies, things like automated workflows, process control engines that demand that the tool behave a certain way that works in conjunction with your end user use policies or your procurement policies, your approval policies. All of those things are important as you're evaluating tools.
Hi, Todd. Question about the purchasing data. If we can go back to the other slide. What's the impact if we don't integrate that purchasing data along with the discovery? What's the impact on our solution?
Well, the impact is this. As I mentioned, you just don't know what you have, because if I purchase 50,000 assets, but I can only discover 40,000, there's 10,000 assets I would never have visibility into if I didn't know what I had purchased to begin with. So understanding that purchasing information is critical so that you can know exactly what should be in your environment and what should not be in your environment. So without that integration with your purchasing systems and being able to validate where that asset came from and that it's a legitimate asset owned or used by the business, you can only provide a subset of asset integrity because you just don't know what you have. So it's a great question. So as I was mentioning before, Gartner believes that this is about 80% process, and that's been our experience here at NCSI, is that without those tools to validate what you're doing and how you're using it in your environment, along with your processes and policies, it's really difficult to have a great program. One of the things that you might also look into as you're evaluating these best practice approaches, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the International Association of IT Asset Managers. It's IAITAM.org, IAITAM.org. That's a great resource for you if you're not familiar. They have certification programs where you can become a certified software professional, hardware professional, asset manager. I've done all of those, and they're excellent. They're excellent training and they're excellent certifications to help you really be able to roll out a best practice environment in your asset discipline. So again, they have a library that you can subscribe to with all of these best practices. On the right side there, you'll see they have 12 what they call KPAs, key process areas, and they have just a wealth of best practice on how you do acquisition management, identification management, disposal management, on and on. So an excellent resource for you to go out and look at while you're trying to prepare and evaluate providers or build some internal strategies on how you're going to be successful. So that's the kind of the basics that we want to talk about today. We could spend a long time, and maybe we will in later webinars. But we want to jump over to, so why do executives care? Why does business care about asset management? And whether you're a leader in your company today, or you're an administrator, or you're a consumer, understanding these issues will be helpful to you as you try to build a solution that will bring value to your enterprise and get the executive support that you're looking for. So let's review what these 6 things are. As I've traveled around over the many years I've been doing this, I see that there are commonly 6 things, 6 different themes that come up almost every time. So let's review what these are, see if they match what's in your environment. Some of these you'll probably go and shake your head, yeah, that's exactly our problem. Others may not be yours, they're not universal, but hopefully they'll provide some insight. If you are not familiar with kind of what those business drivers are, it'll give you the ability to think about how you can approach your program to give value back to your company. So when I'm ever in a room full of ITAM leaders or IT leaders, I'll say, what's the issue? Why are we here today? What's going on? And the first thing almost universally they'll say is, Todd, we just don't know what we have. We're not sure what we should have. We're not sure who's using it, where it's at. It's a real challenge. We've got a lot of asset hoarding going on. People just won't return their assets. We're really struggling to get our arms around this. We have lots of different tools, most of which are Excel spreadsheets that different people are keeping up to date, but we don't really trust any of the data. And the bottom line is we just don't know what we have. Now, whenever I hear that, I think, gosh, here we are in the year 2019. We've done all of these crazy IT things that we have in our world now. We shop at home, we do all these things, but for one reason or another, we still can't figure out what assets we have. And the reason for that is that it's challenging if you don't have good foundational components. The next thing that those executives will say to me is, Todd, not only do I not know what I have, but I have no idea what it's costing me. So I don't know where those costs are allocated. I hear a lot of people complain about IT services, but I know we're spending massive amounts of money, but I'm not really sure where it's going, and I don't know really how to provide a forecast for my peers. I'm kind of embarrassed, to be honest with you, when my peers come to me and say, hey, we're thinking about growing the business in our division by 20% next year. What do I need to budget for or forecast for asset management or for IT assets? Well, if you're a CIO, imagine the struggle that is to not know what you have or what it costs, and then have your executive peers ask you, tell me what we should forecast for next year. It's a really difficult challenge because we just can't equate the relationship between assets, who's using them, and where those costs are allocated. But it is very, very meaningful, especially to those companies that are trying to get their arms around cost control. The third thing that we'll hear is, and sometimes this could be number one or number two, is if the customer has just come out of an audit or a regulatory problem, maybe they've had a breach in data where they've been exposed to a software audit, or perhaps they've lost some confidential data. We all know what happens to the valuation of a company when it gets out on the World Wide Web that we just, this company breached 10,000 of their users' social security numbers or credit card numbers. So this is a big issue for executives, especially on the security side. How can I make sure that we're safe? How can I make sure that I'm compliant? How can I know that if I don't know what assets I have and who's using them or where they're at? So this is really a big concern. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes it comes across as the very first thing they'll say, but it's usually because they've just come out of some type of a breach of an audit or a regulatory concern. The fourth thing that I'll hear is they'll say, Todd, we're really concerned because our end users are not really pleased with the performance we're giving them. And typically this is around onboarding or giving the customer access to the tools they need to do their job. So a unique thing happens in our industry when we as IT professionals can't give our end users the services they need. We call it shadow IT. And shadow IT is this horrible thing that happens when even full business lines say, look, don't listen to IT. We've got a job to do. Just take the credit card, go buy what you need, and let's get on making money for the company. When that happens, it might solve the problem short term, but long term it turns into a disaster because we have all kinds of different hardware, software that we have to support. It enhances security challenges. It is just a big time problem when we allow shadow IT to creep into our environment. But it has everything to do with asset management, because if we have good control over what assets we have in our environment and we can reclaim those assets, and here we go back to that asset hoarding problem. I suspect if I could see all of your faces and meet with you personally, I'll bet you a nice good steak dinner that over half of you or more, let's even be brave and say 70% of you have an asset hoarding problem where people will not give the assets back. And the challenge with that is if I've got to go buy another machine to take care of a new employee or a new need or a new project, and I already have those assets sitting under a desk or in a closet, that's not only a cost issue, a performance issue, but it's a timing issue. And so it all leads to this where these end users are unhappy. So what we need to do to break that cycle is we, again, go back to sound data where we have a great stock management system in our ITAM practice, where we have confidence that what we say is in stock is in stock. And when somebody asks for something, we can immediately give it to them. And once we can break that cycle of making sure the end user can really get what they need when they need it, that asset hoarding tends to go away. But it's really tough to overcome that when you don't have confidence in your inventories or what you're trying to accomplish. So executives are very much concerned about this issue of end user satisfaction and the impacts of the negative impacts of shadow IT when it's not in a good state. After this, at this point, a lot of times I kind of feel like the family therapist. People will start opening up about the challenges, the frustrations, and then they'll generally sit back in their chair and say, on top of all that, Todd, we don't have any more resources. I have to do more with less. So how can I scale the business? How can I grow? How can I get rid of these redundant processes, these systems that don't work together, so that I can deliver a better set of services? So I do know what I have, what it costs, be secure, be regulatory compliant, and also make sure my end users are unhappy. So as you're evaluating those tools, the integration of those tools with things like service management, external enterprise systems, they're all really important to be able to deliver more with less, because we all know that in the world we operate in, there's never enough resources for IT. There's always more than we can handle. So we have to figure out a way to be smart and do more with less. And the last thing I'll hear from these executives is something they call enterprise fiscal accountability. And I think what this really means is that they want to have a seat at the table with their executive peers and know that the data they're sharing is accurate and timely, and they're no longer embarrassed by not knowing what they have, who's using it, what it costs. Am I really secure? My end users are happy. They want to have that as part of the ITAM and their IT operations offering, and it has everything to do with asset management. So those are the kind of executive concerns that we see regularly. And I think the important part for our discussion today is no matter where you're at in your journey, as I mentioned earlier, building a successful program can take several years. But what's important is to understand those business drivers and make sure that whatever you're rolling out, the tools, the processes, the policies, the offerings, that they're satisfying those critical needs to help answer those fundamental questions. Oftentimes we get rat-holed into a discussion about, do I have a barcode scanner that'll do this special thing, or can I integrate with this really homegrown thing that's, would make my life easier as an administrator or a technician? When we tend to ignore the bigger question of, what do I have that gives me the ability to walk into one of our upline management team and say, look what we're doing here to reduce costs, to enhance security, and to make sure our end users are happy. When we focus on those things, we can really get upstream acceptance. We can become sponsored by executives who are looking to throw more money at the tool because you're delivering value. So these are all reasons why understanding why or how asset management impacts your world is so important.
All right, can we go back to number 3 a little bit and talk about security, since it's so important in today's world? Why is the security team going to care about asset management, and how will I, on the asset management team, how will I work with and how will I let them participate in the process?
Great question. And as I mentioned earlier, your best friend when you're trying to get a program up and running is the security folks. Because if you can help them know exactly what hardware and software is in your environment, who's using it, when it goes missing, all of those kinds of activities, which are part of the asset management discipline, you are going to have an advocate for your program and the things you're trying to accomplish. So I would, as you're rolling this out, I would work very closely with your security people. If you're having a hard time getting justification, let your security people go to your executive upline and say, look, if we don't get this, we can't keep the environment secure, because it's just that important. So I think working with them, working closely with them, helping them make sure that they can get the information they need to do their job, perhaps things like when an asset goes missing, or if an asset has a particularly high level of confidential data on it, or is being used by someone who has a lot of intellectual knowledge or intellectual property knowledge or security knowledge that could be damning outside of the company. That's really important, to be able to help the security people know the relationships that exist between assets, users, and locations.
Okay, great, thanks. And then back on the discovery aspect of it, if they have good discovery data, why is that not enough?
Discovery only tells you what's there, but it doesn't tell you what should be there. So if I've got 5,000 assets I'm managing on SCCM or EPM, that tells me, yeah, I've got 5,000 assets. But if I don't know what I purchased, where are those other 10,000 that aren't on the wire? So it's sometimes many of our customers actually don't have good procurement history. So they have to start with, they don't know what their costs are. Let me tell you another reason why knowing a little bit of procurement data is so important. Think about asset refresh. When you want to refresh your assets, you would like a tool that comes back to you and says, hey, next 2 months from now, we've got to refresh 300 laptops because they've hit the end of life. Well, if I don't know when I purchased them, if I don't have a procurement date, I can't calculate for you when they need to be refreshed. So understanding that procurement data is really important. And so that, along with the discovery data, is helpful. But sometimes if we don't have that, we just have to start with maybe all we have is that SCCM data or that EPM data. If that's the best you can do, then we start to refine and enhance those procurement relationships going forward, so that a year from now, 2 years from now, we're out of this mode of not knowing what we should have, and we know more than just discovery. We know what we should have, we know who it's assigned to, and we let discovery do its natural job, which is just validate that it's there and make sure that the assumptions that we're making as an asset management team are being validated through the discovery tool. Great question.
And I'm sure it's hard to put a ballpark number on the delta or the difference between, the discovery and the purchase information. But are you able to give us, like, what percentage would we be missing? Just the difference between the discovery data and the purchasing. How much are we typically missing if we're not including that purchasing data, or is it just across the board?
Well, it's across the board, but think of it this way. If you don't have purchasing data and you don't know all of your assets, and let's say that someone took a high-end server and it just comes up missing, that might be, thousands, tens of thousands of dollars from an acquisition, kind of a loss in terms of the value of the asset. But even more important than that is, what about the security? What, for a security person, if we're bringing assets into our environment through an uncontrolled gate, and we don't know about that, and because we don't have good procurement controls and information. Let's say somebody's out bringing in all kinds of new laptops. My security risk is through the roof because I don't know what's in my environment. I don't know. I might get an agent on there and be able to report it from discovery, but maybe somebody doesn't have the agent on there, the SCCM agent, or maybe you don't have the network controls that you need, and someone is out sharing confidential data across the internet. So in every aspect, knowing what you purchase is really important.
Okay, question coming in here, real high level question about organizational structure. What recommendations do you have to organizing the organizational structure to ensure success?
That's a great question, and I'll tell you what my experience is, and the same advice that the International Association of Asset Managers will give you, and that is that you need a dedicated asset manager. That position is key because in the asset management world, you're going across multiple silos and multiple organizations. And if you don't have someone that can go across all those organizations and reach out and participate both through good relationships and understanding kind of the politics and the silos that exist, getting asset management to work across the enterprise is very, very difficult. And that person, that individual, should also be sponsored at a level through an executive command, whether that comes through, the office of the CIO, or it comes through, sometimes we see it through the office of the chief financial officer, sometimes through the VP of operations. It just depends. But regardless of the chain of command that individual comes through, they need to be supported and have kind of air cover, if you will, across the enterprise, because the challenge is you're going to have some organizations who are going to be willing to play by the rules and others who are not. And this is a challenge, and this is something that takes a strategy for you to be successful with. Sometimes you're kind of in this environment where you're starting against, you don't have a lot of friends in the environment, but you've been told, hey, we've got to get control of this. My recommendation is start with those organizations where you can deliver value. Take that back uphill to your stakeholders, let the stakeholders see what you're offering, and then have them come back and say to the organizations that don't want to be that friendly to you at the time, say, look, this is great stuff, you have to do it. So don't try and fight the battle yourself, but pick your battles and pick the battles that you can win at and pick the functionality that you can deliver to get value. It's really kind of you have to be smart about it. And let me just add this. One of the biggest challenges I see is that people, a lot of great individuals, are out there doing wonderful things in asset management, but they don't document their own successes. So it doesn't do you a lot of good if you go out and solve, all the challenges in ITAM in your company, if you don't document where you came from so that you can show in contrast to your upline executives, hey, this is what it looked like before we started, and this is what it looks like now. There's a level of salesmanship that has to be part of this process so that you can let everybody know, hey, this is what it was before you gave us some money and allocated it, dedicated staff for this. Here's what it is now. So make sure you document your successes, pat yourself on the back and share those successes, because that's the thing that will get you the executive support you need as you move from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 and so on. Well, I think we're into this. We wanted to run about 40, maybe 45 minutes. We don't want to take too much of your time, but I'm going to skip down here to what we're going to talk about next time in our next webinar. And we're going to talk about that critical data. You heard me reference several times about having this foundational data. And quite honestly, if you don't get the data, that foundational data right, so that you have quality data, it's really hard to be successful. So next time we meet, we're going to talk about important data, things like location data. If you don't know where you're assigning those assets, that's a problem. organizational data. What are the cost centers and business units that we're going to allocate that to so that we can run that report and give it back to the CFO? I promise you, when you walk into the CFO's office with an accurate assessment of assets by cost center or business unit in the company, and they go, is this really where the spend is? That's a home run. So we'll talk about that organizational data. We'll talk about user data. Certainly, if we don't have good user data, we can't allocate those assets appropriately. We'll talk about vendor data in regards to being able to gather purchasing data. So maybe you don't have great purchasing processes today. Maybe you do. But there are lots of other avenues out there where we can go and find good purchasing data. Maybe I'm buying, as I said earlier, from HP, Dell, Lenovo, CDW, Insight, SHI, wherever it is, they have a lot of good data that they can share with you, and that feeds that purchasing data. That gives us a chance to know, hey, this is what is in our environment. We know because we purchased it. And then as we use those discovery tools, we can validate it, and that's when we're on a rock-solid foundation. Talk about catalog. What's a catalog? What's a standards catalog? What's its role in your environment? And so that I can control, have things like stock management, and know what assets I'm allowed to have in my environment. Contract data. Maybe we're looking to get on top of our entitlements. We want to know what are the legal entitlements we have for a certain piece of software. So we'll talk about that. And then, of course, that discovery data. We've already mentioned that has to be part of it. And when that all comes together, that's kind of that foundational data that'll set you up for success. So that's what we'll talk about in our next meeting. I hope this has been helpful. We are always here to support you and help you if you have questions. And if there's any other questions, we'll take them. And John, I'll pass it back to you.
We do have a couple of questions here. How is inventory management different from asset management?
Inventory management is a component of asset management. Inventory, I suspect what you might be alluding to is what do I have available in inventory versus what's being consumed. That is certainly part of the asset management discipline, is to know not only the allocation and use of all assets that are allocated to users, locations, projects, whatever, but also what's available in inventory. Inventory is critical when we think about that fourth step of making those end users happy by getting onboarding. If we don't know what's in inventory, it's very, very difficult to be able to allocate and get onboarding and offboarding in a timely fashion. So inventory management is a part of asset management and a very important one. And as you're rolling out your program, again, once you have good inventory management, you can break that cycle of hoarding. If you don't have good inventory management and your end users don't believe you that you'll ever get them the asset they need because they waited forever for the first time, breaking the cycle of hoarding is very, very difficult.
Excellent. Yeah, another question here. Is there any template package available that an organization can reference to help them with getting a better handle on their processes over asset management?
Yes, I would highly recommend that you look at the International Association of IT Asset Managers, the ITAM.org site. There's a lot of free information there. If you go to the resources tab, there's just some excellent articles, starter articles about what is ITAM, what are the key components. If you want to take it a step further, you can subscribe to their service and get into their best practice library, which is extremely rich in those best practice techniques. Here at NCSI, I mean, we're trying to be vendor agnostic and product agnostic, but should you ever want some assistance from us, we also provide that kind of a service. So I would start with ITAM. If you don't feel like you're getting what you need there, then we would be glad to help you.
And Todd, I'm not sure if we added your email address to the last slide there or not. I could put it in the chat box here as well too, but please feel free to reach out to Todd if you have any questions. 20 plus years of experience working with asset management. You came on board here. You're actually on the NCSI team now has it been 2 months, Todd, or just recently?
Yep, getting close to 2 months, yes. But prior to that, I was with Avanti for several years, for about 8 years total, and spent a lot of time working on the asset management practice there, both in sales and development and engineering.
Please feel free to reach out, or you can call us at the main line here at NCSI as well. Todd and his team are available even to come out on site or talk with you privately as well about your concerns. Before we end this today, Todd, we've got some binoculars to give away to help us discover things. Any of those questions did you like the best out there?
Lots of great questions. I really like the question about, what kind of an organizational structure do we need? Because I see so many customers struggle with that. A lot of times ITAM people are asked to do that as part of their second job. So they have their regular duty, and on top of that, I want you to build an asset manager program. That's pretty tough. So I think the person that asked that question and the insight into knowing what's the right organization would be the winner today.
Okay, great. So Ryan, we'll get the binoculars out to you. Thanks for asking those questions. Todd, thanks for joining us here at NCSI and on the webinar today.
Thanks for spending some time with us today, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, and have a great day, everyone.